Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this last video for Unit 12, we're going to look at long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. So, long-run macroeconomic equilibrium is where short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand all intersect. So it differs from the short-run macroeconomic equilibrium in that we're bringing in long-run as well and making all three curves intersect. At that intersection point, we'll see that the economy produces full employment output, which is the level of real GDP that's associated with the natural rate of unemployment. If you remember from Unit 11, we said that the natural rate of unemployment is when you only have frictional and structural unemployment. There's no cyclical unemployment that comes from a bad economy or an economy that's in a recession. Talk more about that in the next unit. So let's go ahead and draw long-run macroeconomic equilibrium, and then we'll do some stuff with it. So again, labels, we have real GDP and the price level, aggregate demand, which downward slopes, and then short-run aggregate supply, which upward slopes. And then sometimes students struggle with how do you deal with long-run in terms of drawing it. What I like to do is make a dot here, and then I like to bring it down to the axis and then up, and then draw long-run aggregate supply. So just like that, it doesn't have to be perfect. As long as it's visible that all three curves intersect, that would work just fine. And then, of course, the GDP that they're producing is YF, the full employment output. And then the price level, we bring that over, and that's going to be the full employment price level, PLF. So this is an economy that is in long-run equilibrium, and as you notice, it's also a short-run equilibrium because aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply intersect. Now, one thing I do want to do before we kind of change this up a little bit is show you how that would look on the production possibilities curve. So that may seem a little strange, but remember we said in the long-run aggregate supply video that PPC and the long-run aggregate supply curve are effectively the same curve. And so it makes sense to kind of illustrate that relationship. With the PPC for the economy, you may wonder, okay, what labels would I use here? We typically use capital goods, which is another way of saying physical capital. And down here, we would say consumer goods. And so every economy either makes stuff that's going to be used right away or things that are going to be used to make other goods and services consumer goods. Typically, the PPC is drawn as increasing opportunity costs, just like that. And we said that any point on the PPC represents full employment or maximum sustainable output. And so YF would be somewhere on this graph, on the curve itself. Okay, so that's YF. It could in theory be the same YF as this YF right here. So we're saying that they're the same spot, just drawn on two different graphs, right? So they represent the same thing. And so we'll come back to the PPC in a minute to see how it relates to what we're doing on the ADAS graph. So let's go ahead and slide back to the ADAS graph here. And so the one thing I want to do now is talk about a shock here and then how that works in the short run and in the long run. So in the short run, let's say for some reason there's a positive demand shock, and so we're going to say aggregate demand would shift to the right, just like we saw in the last video. So AD1. And then, of course, we have our arrow indicating that it moved to the right. And now we have a new short-run equilibrium, okay? A new short-run equilibrium. And so that's going to occur, and I'll do it in a different color just so you can see this. That's going to occur where AD1 intersects short-run aggregate supply. And so we see we have a Y1. This is not a new full employment output, because we haven't moved long run. Long run's still at YF, okay? So this is a short run output, not a long run output, because full employment output is still at YF. So make sure you understand that. and then we'll come over here, and then we have a price level. This is not a full employment price level because long run aggregate supply isn't there, but it's PL1. And so what we see here is that both real GDP and the price level have increased. They have a direct relationship, and so we're producing more than full employment output, and we have a higher price level. Now, while the higher price level may not be a good thing, we do have more GDP, so more is being produced. However, what we would say here is this is not sustainable. And the way we can show it's not sustainable is by, one, looking at the production possibilities curve. So how would we show Y1 on this production possibilities curve? Well, it would be a point outside the PPC, which seems really weird because if you remember back in Unit 1, I said, hey, you can't produce outside the PPC. That's true in micro. But in macro, when you have a whole economy, you can produce outside YF. It's just you're not going to be able to do that for over a longer period of time. And the question is why? Why will the economy actually come back to YF and not stay at Y1? And the answer has to do with the sticky wage theory, which really is kind of the linchpin of this whole unit. Really important to understand this. So remember, in the short run, prices, resource prices, are sticky and they don't change, right? They stay the same. In the long run, input prices are allowed to change. And so what we see here is that they're actually going to increase. Why? Because the price level increased. So in the long run, input prices are increasing, right? And so if I'm a firm, that means I can't produce as much as I did before because of these higher prices, right? So in the short run, yes, AD shifts to the right. But in the long run, we're going to see SRAS shift to the left because of the flexibility of resource prices in the long run and the fact that because AD shifted to the right, we have a higher price level. And so what's going to happen is we're going to have a new SRAS curve that goes through long run just like this, SRAS1 left, and we are back to full employment and full employment output. The only difference, really, between where we started and where we finally end, I'll do this in green, is that we now have a higher price level at PL2. So the net effect of this whole situation here, this long-run adjustment, is that the price level is higher, significantly so, than it was originally at PLF. So this is PL2. We could also think of this as PLF1, if you want to think of it that way. So if the full employment price level has increased from one long run to another, but we notice YF hasn't changed. And in fact, no matter how you do this, YF is never going to change. The only way YF can change is if we shift long run aggregate supply to the right or to the left. And if we did that, that would mean on the PPC graph, we would shift the PPC out for an LRAS shift to the right, or in if there's an LRAS shift to the left. They move in the same direction. And so this whole process here is called, and I'll go ahead and write it out here, it's called long-run self-adjustment. Okay? So this is what the economy does and according to classical economic theory, this is what the economy does on its own. If there's a change in the economy, in the long run, the idea that resource prices are flexible will cause short-run aggregate supply to either shift left or right to put the economy back in long run, right? So with AD and SRAS, you see that they'll move in opposite directions to make that happen. Students sometimes ask, well, can SRAS shift to the right and then back to the left? Yes, but typically what you will see is that there's a change in aggregate demand, and then due to the flexibility of resource prices in the long run, SRAS will move the other way to fix it, in air quotes, and the result is just a much higher or potentially much lower price level depending upon what happens. And so a couple things I want to reiterate to you about this before we wrap up this video and this unit. The first one is, if a question on the AP exam or practice or whatever is talking about something in the short run, don't automatically do the long run self-adjustment. Don't do that adjustment unless the question's asking for it. If it's talking about, hey, what will happen in the long run, then you can make the long run adjustment. Otherwise, just look at the short run change, which in this case would be aggregate demand to the right. The other thing I would encourage you to do is practice with this model. Practice shifting the curve in the short run. What happens to GDP, price level, inflation, deflation, unemployment, and then do the long run correction to put the economy back at YF with a much higher, much lower price level than before. And also, don't forget the connection to the production possibilities curve. So Y1 would represent a unsustainable level of output, but we can also have something inside the curve, which would actually represent what we'll learn in Unit 13 is called a recession, when there's high levels of unemployment. In the case of Y2, there's too much cyclical unemployment. In the case of Y1, there's not enough frictional and structural unemployment. Basically, with Y1, you've gotten to a point where there's so little unemployment that there's people in jobs that are basically doing jobs they may not like, whatnot, and yes, you have a really low unemployment, but you want to see people move, you want to see people go to jobs that they like, you want to see jobs disappear that are not conducive to a productive economy. So in the case of Y1, we need a little more frictional and structural unemployment. In the case of Y2, we could use with a little less cyclical unemployment that's causing the economy to be in a recession. So that is all for this video on long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Until next time, have a great day.